storage, and ending all new coal, oil and gas expansion in a just and equitable manner. The clean energy revolution must reach everyone, everywhere. But developing countries face crippling capital costs and a fraction of global investment. They also need far greater support to adapt to worsening climate impacts, protecting lives and building resilience. We need a quantum leap in climate finance to lower the cost of capital and expand concessional lending. Developed countries must lead in delivering predictable, affordable finance through multilateral development bank reform, effective debt solutions, and tools that crowd in private investment at scale. COP30 in Belém must be the turning point, where the world delivers a bold and credible response plan to close the ambition and implementation gaps, to mobilize the $1.3 trillion a year by 2035 in climate finance for developing countries, and to advance climate justice for all. The path to 1.5 degrees is narrow but open. Let us accelerate to keep that path alive for people, for the planet, and for our common future.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll have remarks by UNEP's Executive Director, Ms. Inger Andersen. Over to you, Ms. Andersen.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, nations have had 3 attempts to hit the mark with their national determined contributions, their NDCs. The initial pledge, the INDC, back in COP15, and then the updates that we saw in Glasgow in 2020, and this year's round of pledges ahead of COP30 in Belém. And each time, we have to say, while the countries have made some stretches, they have collectively landed off target. Each time, they have left the world on course for an intensification of the climate crisis. UNEP's Emissions Gap Report 2025 off target finds that only about 1/3 of parties to the Paris Agreement have submitted new NDCs by 30th of September 2025. And while the new NDCs do show some progress and do narrow the emissions gap, as we just heard from the Secretary General in 2035, these pledges are still not strong enough. Global warming projections over this century are now 2.3 to 2.5 degrees centigrade compared to 2.6 to 2.8 degrees centigrade in last year's report. And that is, of course, far from the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degree targets. And we must note that methodological updates account for 0.1 degree of the improvement, and the upcoming withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement will cancel out around another 0.1 degree. And so the NDCs themselves have made only, we're sorry to say, a marginal difference. As a result, we need unprecedented cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, now in an ever-compressing timeframe and amid a challenging geopolitical context. And let's not forget that the world is not even on track to meet the 2030 pledges. Policies currently in place are pointing the world towards a 2.8 degree warming. This situation means that we must accept the hard truth. The multi-decadal average of global temperatures will overshoot and exceed the 1.5 degrees very likely within the next decade. The task, as we just heard from the Secretary General, is to make that overshoot minimal and temporary. To get on a path to limit that overshoot to about 0.3 degrees, we would need to cut 2030 emissions by 26% and 2035 emissions by 46%. And we would have to deploy, yes, uncertain and risky and costly carbon dioxide removal methods to return to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. This will be difficult, but we have no option but to try, because the bill for the consequences of not trying is far, far greater. Every fraction of a degree matters, and every fraction of a degree avoided reduces an escalation of the climate impacts that are harming all nations and limits the risks of irreversible tipping points. Just as importantly, of course, minimizing overshoot reduces the reliance on carbon dioxide removal. We should not and cannot despair. To the contrary, we must become even more determined. The mitigation potential in wind and solar and forestry remains sufficient to bridge the 2-degree gap in 2035. And for the first time, renewable energy sources surpasses coal as the largest source of electricity in the first half of 2025. Excuse me, 2025. As renewable costs continue to plummet, we have, with the right policies, the opportunity for this to become the new norm, driving jobs, driving opportunities, and driving economic growth. And as UNEP data shows, action is growing to tackle short-lived climate pollutants like methane, which can bring temperatures down quickly. Action like this can help us pull the climate handbrake quickly. This report shows us that we must, and that we cannot forget. This action will deliver stronger economic growth, better human health, more jobs, more energy security, and greater resilience. A future every government should be working towards. Now is the time for all countries, particularly the G20 members, to go all in and invest in their future so that we can finally start hitting the right climate targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Andersen. Next up, we'll have a presentation from the report's Chief Scientific Editor, Anne Olhoff. Over to you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keisha. And let's go straight to the next slide. So the key focus of this year's emissions gap report is on the new nationally determined contributions. 39 leading scientists from 21 institutions across 16 countries contributed to the report this year. The production of the report was overseen by an international steering committee. It's gone through external expert review, and the governments of the countries specifically mentioned in the report were offered the opportunity to comment on the preliminary findings pertaining to their countries as usual. Next slide, please. As this figure shows, global greenhouse gas emissions continued to increase in 2024, reaching a new record of 57.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. This represented a 2.3% increase from 2023 levels. And as the figure shows, the increase occurred in all categories of greenhouse gases, and it also occurred across all major sectors. Even though fossil fuels account for about 69% of global emissions and are the key driver of total emissions, deforestation and land use change was decisive for the rapid increase in 2024 emissions. Next slide, please. Despite the Paris Agreement requirement to submit new NDCs by February this year, only about 1/3 of parties had done so by the cutoff date for this report of 30th of September. For the emissions and temperature projections of this report, we zoom in on the 60 parties covering about 63% of global greenhouse gas emissions that had either submitted or announced a new NDC target containing a greenhouse gas mitigation target for 2035 by the 30th of September. And these include the 7 G20 members that you see on the screen that had submitted a new NDC target by this date, and also the 3 members that had announced such targets through high-level statements of intent by the 30th of September. For parties that have not yet submitted a new NDC, the report assumes a continuation of current policy trends. All the new NDC mitigation targets of the G20 members imply progress in terms of reducing emissions in 2035 beyond emissions associated with the NDC targets for 2030. Next slide, please. To assess whether the new NDCs of the G20 represent increased mitigation ambition beyond what would result from policies already in place, this figure compares G20 emissions in 2035 with those expected under current policies. In total, the new NDC targets by G20 members are estimated to result in emissions in 2035 that are about 2.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents lower than those under current policy projections. And this estimate increases to 3.6 gigatons of CO2 equivalents when expanded to cover the G20 as a group. You can also see that these estimates include the NDC of the United States of America, which will only remain active until the US leaves the Paris Agreement. And as shown in the figure, the exclusion of the NDC of the US and the updated current policy projections have significant implications for the estimates. Next slide, please. Let's then look at the emissions gap, the gap between global emissions in 2035 resulting from the full implementation of unconditional and conditional NDCs and the levels consistent with below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees pathways has narrowed compared with last year's assessment. But as the figure also shows, it remains large. The full implementation of unconditional and conditional NDCs reduces expected emissions in 2035 by about 12 and 15% respectively compared with 2019 levels. But these reductions are far smaller than the 35 and 55% reductions needed to align with 2 degrees and 1.5 degree pathways. Next slide, please. This also means that although the temperature projections are about 0.3% degrees lower than in last year's assessment, as also pointed out by the Executive Director, they remain far above the goal of the Paris Agreement. The temperature projections shown on the slide highlight the significance of immediate action and of credible net zero plans and their implementation. As you can see from the slide, there's almost a 1 degree difference between projections based on current policies, which point to global warming of up to 2.8 degrees over the century, and those that are based on the most optimistic pledge-based scenario included in the report, which assumes the full implementation of both the conditional NDCs and the full achievement of all net zero pledges. This would limit global warming to 1.9 degrees of Celsius over the century. Next slide, please. Due to the continued delay in deep emissions cuts, exceedance of 1.5 degrees of global warming is approaching, and 1.5 degree pathways now imply higher temporary overshoot of this temperature limit. However, this merely stresses the need for immediate and unprecedented levels of mitigation to limit the magnitude and the duration of overshoot to the lowest possible level, thereby also minimizing the increased reliance on uncertain, risky, and costly carbon dioxide removal methods in the future. Every fraction of a degree of global warming avoided matters. It limits the escalation of risks, damages, losses, and adverse health impacts that are already being experienced today and which hit the poorest and the most vulnerable the hardest. It also lowers the risk of irrevocable impacts and of triggering climate tipping points that would lead to abrupt and irreversible climate changes. Next slide, please. The good news is that there has been significant progress made since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and that opportunities for accelerating climate action and ambition abound. Global warming projections based on policy projections as well as on NDC projections have dropped by about 1 degree Celsius since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. We now have net zero emission pledges that cover about 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, renewable energy technologies have undergone a transformation and continue to exceed even the most optimistic projections. So the solutions needed to course correct are available. They're available at low cost, and they can deliver stronger economic growth, better human health, more jobs, energy security, and resilience. This means that the international community is now in a far better position to accelerate climate ambition and action than a decade ago. And as this report emphasizes, such acceleration is critical. Next slide, please. Let me end by thanking you on behalf of the authors, the steering committee members, and the entire production team of the report. Thank you, and back to you, Keisha.
Thank you very much, Anne. So that wraps up the first part of the press conference. We will now move straight on to media Q&A, and as requested, please state your name. Well, we have your names and outlets. So we'll start with the first question, which comes from Aniket Narawad from the Financial Times, who says the report notes that investment signals in new nationally determined contributions remain limited based on analysis up to May 2025. Since then, several additional NDCs have been submitted. Have you observed any improvement or stronger investment signals in those more recent submissions? And more broadly, do you see greater clarity emerging around the overall investability of NDCs in terms of how well they guide private capital and financing? Perhaps we'll start with you, Ms. Andersen.
Yeah, and I'll be very brief because I think my colleague Anne Olhoff will give a more comprehensive response. But I'll just say that this is why we have to focus on finance. We have a considerable amount of conditional NDCs, conditional in large part because it's not sure that the financing is available. But we need to ensure that that financing that we promised each other over the years, and latest the 1.3 trillion, that we will work towards that target. And so getting investables, the programs and the projects and the conditional that are listed in the conditional NDCs, getting that actually moving becomes critical. But Anne, can I ask you to go into the details, please?
Yes, I'm afraid I don't have a lot of additional details. This is something we looked into in more detail in last year's report, where we actually made the point that conditional NDCs were an opportunities for countries to outline more clear investment plans for their implementation, especially of the conditional elements. Unfortunately, we were not able to update the analysis beyond the 18 NDCs included in that specific piece. But overall, we do not see major changes compared with this initial assessment. So there's still ample opportunity to explore this more as a potential way forward for countries to raise more investments and finance for the implementation of their NDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We shall move on to our next question, which comes from Ferdinand Vlogel, reporter at the Dutch press agency ANP. I have a question for Director Andersen. Sources have told us that the State Department of the United States has requested that their data be withdrawn from the report. Can you confirm that such requests have been made, and can you comment on it? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We send the report to all countries whose names are mentioned. We did not receive comments from the US in time of the deadline. Thereafter, we did receive a request for the footnote, which we then added. And that's a footnote that you will have read. It speaks to that the US does not support the emissions gap report, et cetera, et cetera. All reports of UNEP are based on science, and they are independently produced with very serious peer review. And it is produced in a consultation with large groups of stakeholders, the lead authors, of course, expert reviewers, the editors, and the countries concerned. And as I mentioned, we always offer countries that are directly referenced a chance to comment on the preliminary findings in the draft report. That's part of what we do. But the final EGR has absolutely not changed or not been updated based on any country engagement. We accommodated the footnote for the singular reason that the US has announced that they are leaving the Paris Accord. But the scientific evidence and the contents of the emissions gap report remains completely unchanged. And after the deadline, as I mentioned, the US asked to be removed. That was too late, obviously, and so we simply added the deadline. Thank you.
Thank you very much for clarifying. We have something here from Bianca Rothier, correspondent from Global TV in Brazil, who says, with COP30 set to take place in Belém, what are the UN's expectations for that conference? And to what extent could COP30 help set a new direction for global climate action?
Well, maybe I'll start out here, but of course, I mean, it's very significant, by the way, that we're meeting in Belém, and we're very, very happy about that. Look, UNEP, we are based in Nairobi. We understand climate change up close and personal, not that others do not, but we live it. We were in a 4-year drought. We saw what it can do to people, to agriculture, and to nature, and therefore that sustains the people, etc. And we saw how it hits the budget. So first of all, I would say that it is unique. Yes, we have been in Lima. Yes, we have been in various other cities, but here we are right smack in the middle of the Amazon and the rainforest. And this is a very, very important element that will help negotiators, I hope, bring the reality of poverty, the pressures on forests, etc., to the fore. So what are we looking for? Of course, working towards the absolutely clear ambition and further stretches encouraging everyone who is able to stretch beyond, get the remaining NDCs submitted, of course, and then look at the finance side, as I referenced before. It's time to get that engine rolling. We are particularly delighted to see our Brazilian friends launch the Tropical Forest Facility, Tropical Forest Forever facility, which we think brings a real new way of thinking about mobilizing finance and has the potential really to invest in these forests for their long-term sustainability. That is absolutely critical. And so we're very, very pleased that that the COP is happening in Brazil, but also that they have placed it in Belém. Will it be complex? Yes, but that's like meetings in Nairobi. We have to understand that living in this big world, not everybody has the fancy infrastructure, and sometimes there's some complexity. That's what those people in those cities journey every day. We surely be able to journey it for a couple of weeks for the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Andersen. We have a question from Bob Bowen at Inside Climate News. I think this is one for you, Anne. Could you please give us a basic explanation of how you calculated the US 0.1 degree figure?
Yes. So basically what we did is we took the emissions projections, with and without the US, and ran them through the climate temperature model that the team is using. And that basically gave a 0.1 degree Celsius difference. I don't know if that's enough, but that is basically what we did.
I think that's clear. Thank you so much. We have somebody, Sverker Lennas, from the newspaper Dagens Nyheter in Sweden, who says, the production gap report for 2025 shows governments planning for double the fossil fuel production compatible with 1.5 degrees. How do you reconcile this development with the urgent need for rapid mitigation action from 2025 as called for by the EGR?
That's a very fact here. I mean, we are not responsible for the production gap report, but these are numbers that have been published. We have to take them on face value. And the reality is, therefore, as our report also points out, that we are not seeing anyone reducing their oil production. To the contrary, that's not what we are seeing in any of the NDCs. We are seeing step up on renewables, step on various other things. We're seeing energy efficiency and carbon capture and forestry, etc. But the actual looking at the production is not there, which is why we have to really put forward that we accelerate the investments in the energy sector into renewable, because we know that it is actually cheaper in most markets. And so we are seeing that states like Texas has invested massively in renewable because it makes economic sense to the consumer. We are seeing this happening across the world. Kenya, just a country that I mentioned before, 92% renewable, still not all connected, but 92% renewable. They happen to sit on the rift and therefore have amazing geothermal as well as solar and wind potential. But the point is that this makes them then energy independent. It makes them obviously offsets potential otherwise cost to the budget. So everybody needs to lean in. To make that happen, we have to have the financing lined up. But yes, production is not part of the NDCs, which of course we mention in the report.
Thank you very much. We have one here from Daniela Chiaretti, who is with Valor Econômico in Brazil, and says, sorry if this is a very basic question. How can we explain what overshoot means in simple terms? Some people think that once we exceed 1.5, there is nothing else to do and they give up. Thank you.
Is that for me, Keisha?
Go for it, Anne.
Okay, so basically, overshoot refers to a temporary exceedance of a given temperature target and the subsequent return to or below that target, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the key here is that it's temporary, that there is sort of a pathway that brings us back to where we started from or below. So that's what overshoot implies. If we don't return, it's basically exceedance or permanently breaching a given temperature target.
Thanks very much.
Maybe I'll try to make it even more simpler. So here's the point. We promised each other in Paris that we would stay well below 2 degrees. And that 2 degrees is measured in 2100. That's kind of the well below 2 degrees. And so we're looking into the depth of how much carbon are we putting into the atmosphere, calculating, are we going to be able to stay well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5? And now, because of all the carbon we have put into the atmosphere, as Anne says, we look like we might very well overshoot that limit, hopefully for a short while, because we are going to rev up the electrical engines and the renewable and all these other actions, so we can bring it back down again. And that's why we're saying every fraction of a degree matters, because it really does matter that we do not overshoot massively, because that would obviously take the bringing it down much, much longer time.
Thank you. Before I proceed, I'll ask Janina Schreiber and David Njagi to please let us know what your media outlets are. I can't read your question until we have that information. So we'll move to Joe Lowe from from Climate Home News, sorry, who asks, did the analysis include China's NDC and the EU's targets? If not, how much would including them and others not included have changed the temperature increase projections? Perhaps that's one for you, Anne.
Yes, so we did include both China's announced target and the EU's announced targets. These were announced as statements of intent during the climate summit in New York on the 24th of September. So basically are included in our analysis. As you rightly point out, more NDCs are, thank God, coming in as we speak, and we will also be assessing these and see whether they have implications for the estimates included in the report. And we plan to do an update of the central estimates as new NDCs come in.
Thanks very much. We have something, a broad one, but an important one from Melina Walling with the AP, who says, what do you want the average reader to take away from this? If you aren't in a position of power, how should you think about the shortfalls in action around the world? And I'll offer this to you, Ms. Andersen.
Thank you so much. I think the sort of short message is that we are off target, we are off pace. The new climate pledges show some progress, but only slightly lowers the temperature rise as countries again kick that can down the road. And so what should individual citizens across the world do? Obviously, be very mindful around the climate crisis, push for these things, and investments in renewable, hold those who are supposed to put money on the table to account, and think about our own personal footprint without carrying the burden, of course, of that, because it is a country effort. But it also makes sense. This is where the new jobs are. This is where the new economy goes. This is where the market is showing that these kind of investments in smart, clean and green is actually driving jobs and opportunities. And this is where the future lies. So lean into this in any way, shape, or form that anybody is able to do at the local, the national, and the global level. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have a follow-up from Ferdinand from Kenza Bryan at the Financial Times, who asks, please could Inger expand on the US asking to be removed? Is that removing emissions data about the US or removing data provided by the US or something else? And by footnote, are you referring to the explanation that the US voiding its NDC will change things by 0.1 degree? Thank you.
I'll have Anne respond to the 0.1 degree, but essentially, yes, there was a deadline by which the countries that we offered the opportunity to comment should have responded. The US did not make the deadline. Subsequently, thereafter, they asked for data about the United States to be removed. That's obviously impossible because it's one planet, one atmosphere, and one impact. And so we will obviously include that data, irrespective of whether they're party or not. But we did include the footnote at their request. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Dries de Smet from De Standaard, I think that's from the Netherlands as well, who says, doesn't the report offer any good news? And it shows that the chance of the Earth warming more than 3 degrees this century seems very low. Way off target for 1.5, but better than older scenarios. Maybe one for you, Anne.
Let me just add, it does offer good news because we are slowly bringing it down. just not at the speed we want. And so the good news, half empty, half full, look, we are slowly bringing it down. We just have to expedite this. And over to you.
Yes, it always depends on the perspective. And I think this year we were also offered the opportunity to actually highlight the progress that has been made during the past 10 years. I think when we speak to media and when we come out with the global numbers, they do not reflect how big a task this is. It's like a monstrous task. And assuming that we could just turn around the whole world, changing the entire way that the world works, economies work overnight, is naive. So I think in reality, of course, we can still change much faster, as we point out in the report, but significant changes are taking place also under the hood, so to speak, in terms of creating the right structures, the governance, legal systems, the policies that are the basic foundation for making these transitions and hopefully for accelerating them very soon.
Thanks very much. We have one here, I think for you also, Anne, Janina Schreiber from ARD in Germany, who says, according to the methodology, did I get this right? For the rest of the countries, you assumed the last submitted NDCs for 2030?
No, we basically, the countries that have not yet submitted a new NDC, especially the major emitters, we assume that they would follow the projections trends given by their existing policies. So basically adopting a current policy scenarios for those countries.
Thanks very much. We have one which came a bit earlier from Anne-Laure Fremont from Le Figaro in France, who says, how do you explain that land use change and forestry carbon dioxide emissions were responsible for 53% of the overall increase in global greenhouse gas emissions last year? One for you, Anne.
Yes. So first of all, LULUCF emissions are the most uncertain greenhouse gas emissions to estimate and count for, and they also experience or show large fluctuations annually. And last year, this 21% increase that we reference in the report was due to extensive wildfires and land use changes, and also further exacerbated by climatic conditions, especially El Niño. So it is unusually high, but we don't expect it to be equally high this year.
Thank you. We have one from Delga Erden-Nesana from Climate and Engineering News, who asks, what do you see as the role of industry and the private sector in achieving countries' NDCs? Do you think industry in the United States will continue to pursue emissions cuts despite the government's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement? Or are companies relaxing their climate efforts? I think you addressed this a little bit, Ms. Andersen, but I'll let you speak first.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously some companies, and this is written in the press, may have adjusted, et cetera, but where the market speaks to what industry is actually producing and selling, that is producing a better product, a cleaner product, a more sustainable product, and more importantly, a cheaper product, that will march straight ahead, because consumers will go for what is a better price. And so I think that, yes, we may see a slower uptake in some markets in the US on the renewable side, but in other places we will see it just accelerate as much as it has done. It's very early, it's too early to begin to gauge some of this, but we can see that the renewable pricing, as I said, has just completely dropped and made it very, very competitive and actually outcompetes. And of course, as I keep saying, the jobs lie there. They do, both in the immediate production of renewable, but also in the downstream and upstream supply chains to these technologies. And so we would expect that that continues. And we would certainly hope that in the broader economy that many companies across the world will continue to hold themselves to account under environmental sustainability systems to ensure that they they do their bit. And here I think many investors globally, many shareholders globally, and many workers who work for these companies globally actually this is what they want, and this is also what the consumer wants. So I think that we will see the markets continue a forward march.
Thanks very much. We have something from David Njagi, who writes for DevEx, who says, please comment on the kind of impact you think the growth of solar support systems in Africa will have on agriculture in terms of reducing emissions, and whether this new trend risks becoming a bubble.
So I can't speak to the great detail, but what I can say is that irrigated agriculture is, of course, critical. It's critical for a number of reasons. One, because you have a lot more intense water use, so you get more crop per drop, which is important because you're not wasting water. You can do precision agriculture with just the drops to that particular crop, and not surface irrigation where it runs in open channels. And so those kind of investments, we've seen them especially in water scarce settings, driving very large economic gains, jobs, opportunities, income, etc. So of course, I mean, diesel-driven irrigation will continue to be in existence in many of the large irrigated schemes across Africa and beyond. But as solar pumps are becoming more and more accessible, and this is again where climate finance can go in and really support those shifts, there are real opportunities. The primary issue has always been the dust on the solar panels, but there are all kinds of interesting solar-driven brooms that can drive across and ease that dust off. So there's a lot of innovation in this space, and we don't see it as a bubble.
Great, thank you so much. We have one here from Sindra Sharma from the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, who says, do you account for military emissions as well as aviation and shipping emissions? If not, how does this represent the true picture of where we are? Maybe that's one for you, Anne.
Yes, we do not include military emissions. We actually look more into that in one of the previous reports, and we simply do not have robust data for military emissions globally. However, we do include international aviation and shipping emissions, and as called international transport, and also included in Chapter 2 of the report.
Thank you. We have one from Isabel Seta from Agência Pública Brazil. In her presentation, Anne explained how each fraction of a degree minimizes the increased reliance on carbon dioxide removal methods. How do the new NDCs rely on these methods? And has there been an increase or a decrease compared to previous round of NDCs? Maybe Anne, you can start.
Yes, I am not aware of any of the NDCs specifically looking into this. Of course, some of the NDCs look into CCS and other carbon storage opportunities or methods, but the carbon dioxide removal methods are for most an investment area in order to be able to develop these opportunities further for the future. So the short answer is, I do not know for sure how much this is covered in the new NDCs. Happy to follow up though.
So we have one final question before we're just about to run out of time, from Alice Martins from Amazonia Vox in Belém, where we will be next week. Following Bianca's question, what do you expect for leaders from the COP30 climate summit? How should leaders position themselves at this moment to provide good guidance for the COP? And I'll give that to you, Ms. Andersen.
Leaders should lead. That's why they're leaders. And leading on climate means leaning in. Leading on climate means understanding the science and understanding that science speaks to policy. Leading on climate and being a leader means understanding that it falls upon them to pick up this work and to really explain it to communities, make the kind of, enable the kind of legislation that will enable great investments, support financing where they are financing, where they fall in the financing group, and ensure that technology can be made available to all countries that need it. That's what this treaty is all about. It's about tackling climate change through mitigation and through adaptation. And right now, we are asking all leaders to take upon themselves that exact leadership so that we can deliver on the Paris targets.
Thank you very much. So with that, and hoping that leaders lead in Belém, we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to media colleagues for your time, your expertise, and your kind attention. We remain available should you have questions. Please get in touch. Thanks very much, everyone.
Recording stopped.